My name's Andy Chaplin and I've wrote a piece called The Revengers. I was inspired to write it by different things I saw in my community, feeling there was a bit of a loss of community, and then COVID come along and I saw the opposite. So I was inspired to write this piece about some of the things that I'd just seen.
When you bait and provocate, we'll retaliate and cut off your hate. Ease in our frustration, make it more personal than masturbation. John, said John with an H. That's a little bit trite. John, said John with no H. Do you always have to be so uptight and in the right? I don't always need your constructive criticalism. I'm just trying to make things not so alive and more light. Alive, lighter, criticism, said John with an H. When it come to a war of words, John with an H was a surprisingly heavyweight hitter, owned by hours of battling British Brexiteers and twatting pro-Trump lumps on Twitter, slaying their inaccurate comments, slashing comebacks before their eyes. His intellectual blade designed to throw shade, collapsing their claptrap down to size. Erudite, primed to win any online intellectual debate. Too expert to take the rise, never emotive. Sleek, steady, super, like a wow clever steaming locomotive. John with an H took a sip of frustrated breath, knowing John with no H was likely to flip, thus preventing another near death. Holding back his words that were terse, behind his stifled pinky purse, then letting out his default frustrated whistle. The tune that broke the camel's back, that started to rack, that got on John with no H's back, his temper bursting like a balloon, pricked by an unintentional musical thistle. I just cannot handle the way you are so constantly judgy. And stop your freaking whistling, it's like living with a demented budgie. John with an H retired to his laptop, his fortress of solitude, for a much needed rest stop. You know, he'd never mean to annoy or come across as blunt. He hated it when John without an H said, you know, at times you're really insensitive, runt. Yes, he was a fan of manners and quiet consideration. And he found that as he matured, well, past the age of 7, there was a significant drop in his level of toleration. Not a fan of loud and lewd. And like John with no H, he was often intentionally rude. John with no H was a more woke bloke. John with no H secretly did roids and used to be a bit mad for the coke. John with an H he looked like a dish, but when it come to dating other men, he always felt he was a bit crapper. John with no H used to drink like a fish, and back in the day, he used to be a bit of a prolific slapper. John with an H used to like to contemplate nature taking in trees. John with no H, he really missed clubbing, and the banter. He just used to like to chat shit and just shoot the breeze. John with an H was a disgruntled ex-teacher who lost his confidence and then the respect of the kids. So he'd always hold back because he'd never want to come across as a preacher. He'd just fume in his room. John with no H, he could not hold back as he released his plume. John with no H was a disillusioned ex-copper. So these days he'd think of nothing of shushing you in the cinema or on a train or doing whatever was needed to stop you. You know, you may have crossed over a line or not stopped at a red light. Well, John with no H thought it was his right to pull up behind you, wind down his window and say, "Oi, mate, you just drove like a bag of shite." And if you jumped in queues, and you would light his short fuse. Yeah, and don't even try and offer the John John shoddy customer service, because the John Johns will have you, and you'll come off extremely nervous. After COVID and then Brexit, there was just so many more things to annoy. But the John Johns found that they're in a rage. Well, it became their shared joy. Unlike John with no H, John with an H didn't crave family or pets or kids. And so in order not to hit the skids and to avoid the inevitable booby trap, the John Johns ignored the fix they once got from their dicks and filled it with Netflix and National Trust coffees and walking holidays with a map. John with no H, he was still restless and still gobby. So he threw himself into fitness and CrossFits, and he would start and cease any random hobby. He tried meditation, but there was no elation. It just led to more frustration. And so that he wasn't tempted by some gym buff strumpet, he tried and failed to learn the trumpet. And to cope with the fact that for years he hadn't scored, and to prevent himself getting even more locked down bored, he tried to learn the chords as he wrote love songs for John with no H on his keyboard. It was a surprise of their lives that for almost 2 decades they'd stayed together. When more passionate, less erratic couples had drowned in the storm, they'd fallen under that weather. But the biggest thing on which the John Johns bonded and they shared, apart from their all each other had, they totally adored each other and cared. The glue that made them united was the need to correct other people, to ensure that wrongs were righted. Jane, with a Y, can get through a day without a good cry. Born with tears, she'd been wet ever since, catastrophising every fear, the drama fully rinsed. She'd take a simple salad and she'd turn it into a power ballad. And any whiff of a drama, it was sure to affect or harm her. And no matter who it belonged to, she'd claim it for her own. And there was one thing Jane with a Y would inevitably do, and that was cry and moan. Jane with no Y had much more control. She spent most of her life working in HR and now in a closing down community library. So somewhere along the way, she lost her soul. When your only friend is Jane with a Y, you learn not to cry. And as your ex-wife has an affair and leaves the nest, saying they simply must fly, you don't question why. You just sigh and you say, no, I don't think we should try. Because you admit their affairs, well, it got them from under your feet. And to you, a good plant or a nice book, yeah, a good rescue pup, that was always far more of a treat. Jane, with no Y's, twins, moved abroad. For someone so maternal to this day, it's still flawed. For years she was happily queen of the call centre, vibing off the sinners and their negative complaints. Jane with a Y was up there with the painter and saints. Until the day she retired, then wham, bam, no thank you, ma'am. Jane felt expired due to the drama she now lacked. So anyone with a problem, she'd attract. It may have been the messed up lass in the multiple occupancy flat next to hers that shouted a bit too much at a babby. And she was worried she was suffering with domestic violence. Or the bullied asylum seeker looking kid she's jammed on her doorstep and look out for, but she was worried that he was suffering in silence. Well, if Jane with a Y could befriend/meddle, then she tried to make it right. And if Jane with a Y could help/interfere, then she'd have something to fight. Jane with a Y's talent was hunting neighbourhood issues like it was on her watch. And if she could squash then scotch, then Jane with a Y would kick that neighbourhood issue to the curb and then she'd stamp it on the crotch. The first time the John Johns and the Jane Janes first met was a Monday March evening during lockdown they'd never forget. The 4 unfamiliar strangers had felt increasingly rankled and emotional due to behaviour in their neighbourhood that they felt was increasingly antisocial. During their socially distant exercise, the four strangers united, thanks to a dangerous delivery driver who just found a match on Tinder who made them feel mutually smited. The young lad sped past in his van and then slammed on his brake, causing Jane with a Y to make a mistake and let out a cry, causing Jane with no Y's, black lab Cara with a K, to bark and to bolt and to show her dismay, causing cycling home John with no H to fall off his bike and hit the slab, and the Janes to run across and say, "Are you right, me bab?" Jane with no Y naturally burst into tears and bollocks the driver, who simply just threw the John's parcel on the lawn because he was something like the Flash, but also a bit of a skiver. But what do you expect when some hours I get paid little more than a fiver? John with no H heard the commotion and with one angry motion dropped his weights and tear-assed out of his garage, only to find his bloody brand new resistance bands had been discarded and the love of his life, John with an H, hurt and disregarded. The delivery driver lad felt totally bombarded, a crying Jane with a Y, an injured cyclist that was in shock that could only sigh, and a roided to be avoided, and friendly and jolly, gay giant, going toe to toe, going eye to eye. The young lad tried to escape back to his van, where he saw Jane with no Y, doing all she thought she can. Because her black lab, Cara with a K, it was the only thing that had ever truly loved her back. She'd just got over losing Cara with a C, who she'd had to have put to sleep after she suffered another similar thwack. So Jane with no Y stole the delivery driver's keys, and she said, "No, you ain't getting them back." Jane with no Y, who'd spent her whole life turning the other cheek. Jane with no Y, who'd ignored a lifetime of homophobic comments and remarks about her size. And she'd never fought back because she always felt too weak. All those jokes about her size, she just never tried to swat away those bitchy flies. Oh, they wanted her out, of that she had no doubt. But Jane with no Y was a woman who was more blunder than wonder, who couldn't shout out because she didn't feel she had any clout. All those cuts that put her in a rut, because she saw firsthand, it wasn't human, that wasn't right. Well, today, Jane with no Y, she was finally facing her fight. She felt totally calm, yet completely insane, like a rational Hulk or a reasonable Bane, as she simply just dropped the delivery driver's lad's keys down the drain. As John with no H and Jane with no Y for once started to laugh and not cry. But John with no H, he simply asked why. He understood the pressure on the driver's shoulder, each parcel paying for a debt, removing a tiny boulder. And he said, and now that he's delayed, he won't get paid. And that's more trouble for his family we've made. So despite his bruise and feeling in shock, this was one boat he didn't want to see sink or rock. He simply went to his porch and pulled out his torch, and with relative ease helped the delivery driver lad retrieve his keys. John with no H, he first felt mad and then bad, seeing John with an H caring for the delivery driver lad. It stung. It brought a reminder of all they'd never had. John with no H, with no kids, no job, spent half of his life just feeling like this fat. He can never switch off his own paternal nature, no matter how hard he tried. But then he saw that Cara with a K was quivering and Jane with no Y was shivering. So he just lifted him up and he carried him inside. Later, over a Garibaldi and a cuppa. Those four strangers bonded. And all of that isolation, it just absconded. Realizing they could no longer live in fear of antisocial trouble, knowing they were breaking the law by mixing their bubble, but instead choosing to ignore, instead plotting, fixing, trying to settle the score. The four unfamiliar neighbours started to build their banner to bring manners back to their manor. Those keys down the drain kick-started their campaign. For Jane with no why, she wanted to get rid of the ongoing cry from those drug dealers' devil hounds. She says, I can't bear to go to sleep another night listening to their sounds as they lay cold and hungry on the grounds. I want to scale their ostentatious gates, and I'd like to get them home with one of me online animal mates. But it wasn't just for the neglected animals that Jane's heart unfroze. Most of all, she wanted to save that community library that those Tory bastards were trying to close. John with an H, he could understand and see. After all, it was his childhood library back home that first gave him the internet, that provided the intellect and sanctuary, the only place in society that the most vulnerable could still go and mix in the warmth for free. But most of all, he wanted to issue the biggest fine to that fly-tipping twat that lived up number 9. He was sick of the sight of seeing his B&M furniture stacked up on the bloody corner of the cul-de-sac, wrecking that one bit of green land they had, damaging that beautiful, beautiful oak. Oh, John with an 80's plans and pants set alight. His spark started to smoke. Jane, with the Y, wanted to help with the ongoing cry from the messed up lass in the multiple occupancy flat next to hers deal better with the baby's cry. She knew it was hard to put up with that sob, especially when you're out of it on skunk and your ex comes around and bashes you up and is often on the rob. And the police and the social workers and the housing, they just don't seem to be able to do their job. But she also wanted to help that bullied asylum seeker looking kid. Oh, Jane with a Y had a list as long as your arm of the things she wanted to get rid. For John with no H, who'd spent his whole life feeling pent, he wasn't sure how to start or if he could repent. But as their plans grew, he knew that this was something that they had to do. The fly-tipping twat found all his rubbish stacked up blocking his door. The drug dealers, devil hounds, they vanished and were rehomed. And those lads woke up being loved on a safer, warmer, carpeted floor. For the messed up lass in the multiple occupancy flat next to Jane with a Y, she was able to deal better with the baby's cry, thanks to the arrival of 4 godparents to provide respite, to say, it's okay, love, you're doing that right. And the bullies were faced by a big gay giant who taught that shy Albanian kid how to be more defiant and how to fight. But more importantly, he taught him how to read. He taught him how to write. That community library was saved thanks to some expert debating and publicity shaming on Twitter. And the place we lived, after what felt like years in isolation, it just felt a lot less shitter. For the sake of our community, for the saviour of our soul. The Revengers were formed to avenge, to make us feel happy again and whole.